who's carrying you.
Shalom and welcome to this live Jerusalem Dispatch ICEJ Zoom event where we have a very special guest as we will be discussing the crisis unfolding in Ukraine after the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. What we're seeing now is an urgent need on behalf of the Jewish Agency in partnership with the ICEJ to help the Jewish people make Aliyah. And we have a very special guest in tonight's episode. We have Dr. Jurgen Buhler, who is the president of ICEJ. David, I just wondered if you could please open up tonight in prayer and your thoughts on talking about this very important topic tonight, and that's the urgency that the Jewish people are in this war-torn country that is Ukraine.
Yes, indeed, Simon. And again, like to welcome all of viewers. ICEJ is at the forefront of help here, as you will hear from Jurgen. It is amazing for our organization throughout the world, how people are just rising to this challenge of this day when we're seeing a prophetic fulfillment, as well as a great need for Aliyah to be made from Jews who are persecuted, and indeed to help all other people. And so as this session goes on, you will hear some amazing facts and ways in which you can help as well.
And David, would you like to pray for this Zoom event, and particularly for our viewers watching tonight? And we really appreciate them giving up their time so that they can hear what Jurgen has to tell us tonight.
Yes, indeed. And our Lord God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we come to you, Lord, in this very troubled world. And we thank you, Lord, that nothing catches you by surprise, that you know all things. But Lord, you want us, Lord, not just to be viewers from a distance in these things, but Lord, participating by the power of your Spirit. And Lord, the things that we will hear, we just pray, Lord, that we will be doers and not just hearers of the word. And Lord, at this pure time, Lord, I thank you that ICEJ was raised up for such a time as this, that Jurgen Buhler was raised up for such a time as this. And Lord, at the end of this time together, may people just say, our viewers say, of a truth, God was in our midst. Amen.
Amen. Let's have a look now at this urgent appeal for Ukraine put together by ICEJ.
Shalom here from Jerusalem. What dramatic days we are living in. The crisis in Ukraine is indeed a crisis that is changing the entire world right now. And what is even more dramatic, it is changing the life of hundreds of thousands of individuals, if not millions of individuals. People say it is the largest refugee crisis since World War II, and Israel finds itself right in the center of that crisis. Just a few days ago, the Israeli government decided to accept non-Jewish refugees, to welcome them here in the land of Israel. And on top of that, even more Jewish refugees are expected. People who will make Aliyah, who will be absorbed as Israeli citizens here in the land of Israel. And Israel has become, because of that, the #1 countries of all the nations that do not border to Ukraine, the #1 countries that receive the most refugees in their homeland. Refugees who arrive to make Aliyah here in Israel, it's a complete different Aliyah, complete different return to their homeland than everything that we have seen in past decades. Those people who immigrate to Israel right now, they didn't have the luxury to think for weeks and months, talk to the Jewish Agency, to the Israeli embassy with their families, how to best make Aliyah. This literally was forced upon them overnight, and they had to flee, sometimes with only the clothes that they are wearing on their bodies. It's a dramatic scene that is unfolding right now in Ukraine, and just a few days ago, the first flight of new immigrants arrived here at Ben Gurion Airport in Israel. On board of that flight were 100 orphans, children that don't have any parents. And the ICEJ, I'm very glad to tell you, is right now working full speed to help those children that are in special need. And also other flights are arriving today on a daily basis, several flights a day. And I'm very glad to tell you that also here, the ICEJ, we could help hundreds of new immigrants to make Aliyah in the past few days. Also, we are working on the ground in Kiev, in Ukraine, and in other cities to help, in particular, Holocaust survivors. Those people who are advanced in age, we want to do our utmost to make it as fast as possible and also as convenient as possible for them to return back to Israel, the land of their forefathers. Some of them might end up in our home for Holocaust survivors in Haifa. Others will be absorbed in families or with friends or in other institutions. And right now, as I'm talking to you, trucks are leaving the country of Finland, Helsinki, in order to bring much needed aid to countries like Poland, where many refugees are waiting for their basic supplies. As a matter of fact, many of our European branches are working right now full speed to help, in particular also the Jewish communities that are fleeing the country of Ukraine right now. Do you see that we are working on all fronts in order to alleviate the pressure that has come upon many people, including the Jewish people in that region? And you can become today a part of it. Your help and your support is so much needed, maybe more than ever before.
Partner with us to rescue Ukrainian Jews now. Go to give.icej.org/Ukrainian Aliyah.
The prophet Isaiah says in chapter 21, verses 14 and 15, "To the thirsty bring water, meet the fugitive with bread, for they have fled from the swords and from the drawn sword, from the bent bow and from the press of the battle." This is exactly what the International Christian Embassy is doing right now. We are meeting those refugees, the Jewish refugees, on the way as they are fleeing the Ukraine. And I want to invite you again personally to stand with us in this time of crisis, to show our support with the nation of Israel, with the Jewish people in Ukraine, but also all those refugees that already arrived here in the land of Israel. And I am sure as you do so, God will bless you as you bless His people. He will bless you in return. Shalom from Jerusalem, and I look forward to hear from you.
Now we see excellent video produced by ICEJ on the urgent crisis that is going on in the Ukraine. And if you wondered what you can do to help, then please help the vital work being carried out by ICEJ in Eastern Europe to help bring the Ukrainian Jews home back to the land of Israel. We'll now pass you over to David, and David has a very close friendship with Jurgen, the president of ICEJ. So no better person to introduce Jurgen than Dr. David Elms.
Well, it's a great privilege to introduce Jurgen. I've known Jurgen now for many years, and what a wonderful blessing he's been, not just to me as a good friend, but to so many people, Jew and Gentile. He heads up the ICEJ, which is your embassy in Jerusalem. And Jurgen, he's pulled together our work in so many different directions. And it's an absolute privilege to just be a part of this wonderful international setup, which is in over 90 countries throughout the world. And Jurgen was really at death's door not so many years ago, and many of us were just praying for him, and we're so glad that the Lord raised him up, and here he is, just able to minister to us tonight, share with us what is going on, and you will just catch a little bit of this man's spirit, which just reaches out, loves the Jew and the Gentile, the church, and all that just come across him. It's a great privilege and an honor to have Jurgen Buhler, president of the ICEJ, speaking to us tonight. Thank you, Simon.
Oh, thank you.
And Jurgen, we're so pleased that you can join us from Jerusalem tonight, particularly as it's a very special holiday in Israel, which is Purim. Can you share with us what today has been like in Israel with the Israelis wearing fancy dress costumes, eating Haman's ears, and carrying out kind of various religious services in the synagogues, where every time the name Haman is mentioned, there's lots of boos and hissing?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, let me say thank you so much for the very kind words and the very kind introduction, David, from you. And it's a great privilege and indeed a great blessing to be with you in the UK here. And Simon, you're absolutely right. It's a very special day today. Actually, today and tomorrow, it's the Purim holiday. It's probably the most joyful holiday during the year. And like you said, people are dressing up in different type of costumes. And during the synagogue service, they are reading through the entire book of Esther, which is an amazing story of salvation and redemption. I would even call it an amazing story of reversal, you know, something that started as bad as it can get, the planned destruction of an entire people in the Persian Empire. And the Lord turned it around that at the end, not the targeted people, the Jewish people were at the end the victims, but God really reversed it, that those who hated them and stood up against them, they have become the people who suffered at the end. So it's an amazing story of the power of prayer. It's a joyful day. And yes, whenever you hear the word Haman, there is a great boo going on in the synagogues. And whenever they mention the word Esther, there's an incredible rejoicing in the synagogue. So it's a great day.
Absolutely. And Jurgen, we're so pleased that you can join us for this live Jerusalem Dispatch, a Zoom event tonight. Now, you are the president of ICEJ, based in Jerusalem, in which you represent over 90 countries across the world to the nation of Israel. And after all, ICEJ is the Christian embassy in Jerusalem, which gives you a kind of unique perspective in terms of your understanding of Israel's needs and what's happening in Israel, but also globally. So as president, how do you view the world through the eyes of ICEJ?
Well, right now, you know, we are living in one of the greatest crises in modern history. I don't think we had a crisis like that in Europe in particular since World War II. And it's really a turnaround, we have to say. A lot of things are changing radically. I see this in a very practical way in my own country, where I was born, Germany. The Green Party that is ruling right now in Germany, they came to power on the slogan "Swords to Plowshares," and their big program was disarmament. Now, this very same party, just a few days ago, signed the biggest armament deal in German history. I believe $100 billion. A lot of the agendas that was not only in Germany, around the world, was on the forefront. They, in a way, went onto the backside of the agenda of many governments, and we are realizing that, you know, people thought we have reached the end of history. We have reached a time where everything is advancing to free market capitalism. And we realized with a shocking world, in a shocking way today, that history returned back to us in full force. And as I said in this video, Israel finds itself right in the center of that, where refugees, both from Russia, there are people, we just welcomed people from Russia that are fleeing, they want to escape the regime there, but also, of course, many of them from Ukraine that are arriving today in Israel. So it's a very dramatic time. It needs a lot of prayer. And I think it's a time also where God calls the church for action.
Absolutely. And Jurgen, can you share your own personal story with us? Because just doing a little bit of research before this, you've got a fabulous history and a fabulous story to tell about your family during the Second World War. But firstly, how did you come to faith in Yeshua HaMashiach? And how did he put a love for Israel and the Jewish people on your heart?
Well, I got saved after a long sinful life and a rebellion against God. I came to faith when I was 6 years old. And this was because my father was pastor. He was pastoring a church, actually in numerous churches. He was a church planter, started some 10 churches in southern Germany. And on an average Sunday, I was on 4 to 5 Sunday services with him. So I literally was soaked in the Word of God. And I remember very well, it was a Canadian evangelist who came. I was a very young child, but as he was preaching, the conviction of the Holy Spirit came over my life. I was sitting there as a young child in that service, and I knew with absolute certainty, if I would die tonight, I would go straight to hell. And I was running forward to the pastor, said, please pray with me. I want to have this salvation, the knowledge of salvation in Yeshua. And he prayed for me. And it was really, I still marvel today. I was just 6-7 years old, but it was a tremendous turnaround in my life where I could see from that moment on God's hand upon my life. Why I love Israel, and this is part of the family legacy in a way, is that my father, he always taught me as a pastor that the Jewish people is a very special people. He took groups to Israel, and every year he was with a tour group touring the Holy Land, and one year he took my brother and me with him. And that's where the Lord spoke to me that my calling is for the Jewish people. And that's in a way, in a nutshell, how it all started.
Fabulous. But can you share this unique story? I know that you've presented a couple of videos which we tried to show on our last Jerusalem Dispatch, but didn't work. So, but now we have you in person. It'd be great to hear your incredible story of your grandparents and really how they defied the Nazis by actually giving them food, and which was then forbidden for them to actually buy food from the grocery store, and what courage and bravery that took in Nazi Germany in the time in the 1930s.
Yeah, I must say, I'm blessed and privileged to have amazing parents and also amazing grandparents. In particular, my grandmother, she was an amazing woman of prayer. She got saved in a very tragic way. They were both non-religious, both of my grandparents. My grandparents, maybe if they were leaning to anything more to socialism/communism, they were very liberal people, and they were 4 boys. They had 4 boys at home. My father was the oldest, and there was this young child. His name was Rolf. They called him Rolfle. And this little boy of 3.5, 4 years old, he got sick at some stage, and he got blood poisoning. Now, you have to remember this was the time when you didn't have readily antibiotics available, so there was not much the doctors could do. However, it looked at one stage that he might improve a little bit. And one morning, little Rolf got up and he told to my grandmother, says, "Mama, I think today at 9 o'clock I will go home." And my grandmother saw that's quite a strange saying. So she watched the boy, and at 9 o'clock he would go into his bedroom, and she followed him. He laid down and he looked up to heaven, and as if he would see something absolutely spectacular. He started to laugh and to smile, reached out to the ceiling, and then his head fell back and he died. And my mother saw Jesus standing at the bed of this young boy. And from that moment, my grandmother, not my mother, my grandmother understood that there is a God in heaven. She got herself a Bible. She didn't know with whom to talk, but she started reading the Bible and to pray. People around her found Jesus, and she started a little church in her home, which was one of the first Pentecostal churches later on in that area. And then, of course, Hitler came to power during that time. And she didn't have teaching of Christian Zionism or about, how to stand against anti-Semitism. This wasn't much a subject that was taught, but they witnessed how Jewish people in their community were treated. And the neighbor of my grandmother was a Jewish family, a Jewish couple. And very soon they couldn't do shopping anymore. So my grandmother offered to them, said, "Well, if you need anything, let me know. I'm going to do all the grocery for you, and I'm going to help you." And my uncle told me just a few months before he died, he says, my father was already at that time a soldier in World War II. But he was at home with his parents, my uncle, and he was telling me that the Gestapo actually many times came to the home of my grandparents, in particular because of my grandmother. She was standing with the Jewish people, but also she had a real zeal to share the gospel. She always had tracts with her sharing about Jesus, and the Gestapo didn't like that. And my uncle was telling me that one day a Gestapo, this was in beginning of 45, a Gestapo officer came to my grandparents to their home and says, Miss Buhler, if you don't stop doing what you are doing, we might put you also in concentration camp. And my uncle was standing behind her watching all that. And she turned to the officer, his name was Mr. Schmidt, and she turned to him and says, Herr Schmidt, you need to remember you have an eternal soul, and one day you need to give answer to God what you are doing here in our country. And my uncle watched that, and he says the guy suddenly became pale. He turned around, didn't say a word, and he never came back again. And honestly, I believe, and I think that's maybe even part 2 of that story, because of my grandmother standing up for Jesus, but also for the Jewish people. I believe that in many ways saved the life of my dad in Russia, who was for 4.5 years a prisoner of war. And I really feel in our family, we can really see that if you bless my people, God is blessing you return. There were many young boys in that prison camp in Russia. Most of them died, but God brought my father back through a great miracle.
Absolutely. But also I want to touch on, Jurgen, your father, Albert, and the kind of miracles that took place during the Second World War. The fact you mentioned there that when he was at school, was not drafted to join the SS, but when he was 18, had to join the Wehrmacht, the German army during the Second World War. And the first fighting they saw was at Arnhem, where the British paratroopers were landing in the Netherlands to try to cut off Germany as a quicker route to land in Germany in September of 1944. Interestingly enough, I interviewed a fabulous guy called David Baumann, who was a paratrooper, and actually with the British Army. He then went on to serve in the IDF and fought in Israel's War of Independence. And not only that, he was the first person to set up the paratroop regiment in Israel, fought in that war. Can you share with us how, through actually a miracle, that God protected your father from actually entering the front line, and the various other miracles that your father went through, as clearly God's hand was upon him to keep him safe?
Yeah, and you know, to correct what you said, my father actually was drafted into the SS. There were one morning, some SS officers came to his class when he was in high school, and they looked, I'm not sure how they looked out for people, but my father was one of the guys that they chose to join the ranks of the SS. And he was together with another young man from a believing family. They both notably weren't believers at that time. They didn't really join the faith of their parents, but somehow God protected them, and they were coming to the town square, and with the other students, they talked to each other, says, well, I don't think that's a good idea to join the SS, and let's get out of here. And at one point they turned the corner, were running away. And my father kept telling us, he says, I don't know until today, because they had very clear lists who they want to draft in, why they would not come back and look for them. Where is Mr. Buhler? We had Albert Buhler on the list, he's not there, but they never came back to have him. But if my father wouldn't have run away, he would have become an SS soldier. And you're right, the first assignment when he was drafted into the Wehrmacht, the army, was up to the north, to the Normandy, to the area of where the film was made, A Bridge Too Far, and he was heading up there. A young boy, he says, I was eager, like probably many young boys, ready for battle and ready for the action. And on the way up with his battalion, his truck suddenly stopped and halted, and there was an engine breakdown. His comrades with the other trucks, they continued. And after 2 days, they finally got the truck to work. and trucks were coming back in the opposite direction. And there was from the, I think, 3 or 4 trucks with young soldiers on them that left into the direction of the battlefield. Only one of them came back with a handful of soldiers and says, Albert, this is the wrong direction. We all are retreating from our battalion with more than 100 people. Only a handful of them survived. You need to get out with us here. And he says this was the first miracle where if our car wouldn't have stopped, if the engine wouldn't have broken down, he probably would have faced certain death there. And he had a similar miracle in later on. He was telling us many stories, and time would not be sufficient here. But he became, in 45, he became a prisoner of war and was in a Russian prison camp in the area of Bryansk. It was an area, you can find it in Wikipedia, where many German prison camps were with tens of thousands of young German soldiers that were in prison there. And he was in one particular prison where most of the prisoners there were the survivors of the Stalingrad battle. And when he entered the prisons, he says it was a young man sitting there at the prison gate weeping. And he says, well, why are you weeping? And he says, don't you know where you come here? He says, none of us is going to survive. They are going to kill us all. And it's true, from the Stalingrad fighters, none of the soldiers that were prisoners of war came out alive. My daddy many times told me, he says, I was in my age group the only soldier that came out alive of that camp. They died either of malnourishment or pneumonia or other ways. They worked them to death. And one day my father also was hit by pneumonia. This was in probably winter 1946, extremely cold, and they didn't have proper barracks, so he was literally on his deathbed. He had a warden standing at his bed. The purpose was to chase off the rats that started to nibble at his bodies. And the doctor passed by, he heard him say, he says, Buhler is going to die tonight. And he remembered the prayers of his mother and the faith of his mother. And he cried out very loud, he says, as loud as he could do. He says, Lord, if you are really alive, if what my mother was telling me is really true, if you bring me out alive of here, I'm going to become a pastor. And he says in that moment when he prayed that, he saw his whole life from birth to that very moment. He says, I saw it like in a movie passing by me. And he says it was just a fraction of a second, but it was in a way, in a fraction of the second, experiencing 18 years of my life. And a voice came to me and said, the way how you lived your life, you will go to hell. And he cried out to God. The next morning, the doctor came by. He says, Buhler, you look much better. But he said, you need a second miracle because the food that we are giving to you is not enough to survive on. A few days later, a doctor came in. She was in charge of all the prison camp in this area of Bryansk. And she was passing through the big hall. There were probably dozens and dozens of young soldiers that are laying there on the sick bed. And she walked through and stood in front of the bed of my father and said, what does this man get for food? And the attending doctor said, well, like everybody else. And she said, this man needs to survive. You put him on special ratio. And my dad later on asked, he said, who was this woman? I never saw her. And he said, well, she's in charge of all the prison camps and she's Jewish. And he always told us as kids, he says, Jurgen, and he told it to my brother Gottfried, David knows him very well. He says, we owe our lives to the Jewish people in 2 ways. Number one, we have a Jewish Messiah, Yeshua HaMashiach, but also without this Jewish woman in Russia, we as a family wouldn't exist today. And in a way, this put a very special relationship to us as a family, maybe not so much, even though of all the bad stuff that happened in Germany, I do a responsibility, of course, to deal with that and make sure that history will never repeat itself. But for us as family, it's maybe more, you could say, thankfulness to the Jewish people, because in so many ways they saved the lives of our family.
That's an incredible story. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. But you are the president of ICEJ. You are German. You were the former head of the director for ICEJ in Germany. How does it feel that you're in this position where you're working so closely with the Israeli government? You are doing so much to help bring the Jewish people home. You're doing so much to help Holocaust survivors and children with education packs and younger people as well that are struggling. How does it feel to know that you are rewriting a historical wrong, as it were, and showing that love towards Israel and the Jewish people from a German perspective? It must be quite something.
Well, I must say it's very humbling in many ways because, of course, you from the beginning, we are living now 27 years here in the land of Israel. From the beginning, I was a little bit anxious. He said, how is it going to be as a German to live in Israel? And 27 years ago, there were many more Holocaust survivors alive in Israel. And Simon, one of the surprises that I experienced in Israel, and I'm not sure, do you hear that noise in the background? There is or is this just in my speakers? The sound is good?
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah,
okay, very
sounds
good.
Good.
So the first person that we really befriended in Israel was a Holocaust survivor. She was a survivor of Auschwitz. And she met my wife in the bus, and it just happened that she came from the very same town like I was born in Germany. It's a small town, 50,000 people. So this was, I don't think it was a coincidence. And we befriended her, and I was absolutely amazed. I asked her many times, she says, Sarah, doesn't it bother you that you are sitting here and having coffee with a German? And she says, no, on the contrary. He says, actually, that I meet people like you, Germans who love us, who stand with us. He says, this actually gives us hope for the future. And in a strange way, being German and doing the work that I'm doing, in a very strange way, it even helps and even underlines the message that there is a new face of Christianity today that uncompromisingly stands with the Jewish people, loves them, fights anti-Semitism. And the fact that somebody from Germany is leading up that work, for many people, that's really a testimony that we are living in a new season in Jewish-Christian relations.
Absolutely. That's so incredible. And I think that is a way to kind of touch Israeli hearts and Jewish hearts as well. So thank you so much. I also want to bring something in because the last 2 years have been extremely difficult for everyone with COVID-19. Christians haven't been able to go to Israel and fly to Israel like they have been for previous years. We're also seeing that events have been closed down. Now, we know that things are opening up, and the Israeli government have announced that they're relaxing a lot of the restrictions. So Christian tourists can come back to Israel again, and particularly for the feast in September, the Feast of Tabernacles. But how can we engage Christians again with the land of Israel and the people of Israel, since so many of us haven't been to Israel for over 2 years?
Well, first of all, it's a very easy answer. Come to Israel, and even more straightforward, come to the Feast of Tabernacles. We are actually right now under full speed preparing the Feast of Tabernacles this year. I must say we need a lot of prayer. The last 2 years were a tremendous challenge for us. For the first time, we presented an online feast. It was a way that we never did it before. And by the grace of God, we could reach more people than ever with the Feast of Tabernacles. What really was amazing, we had Sukkot or Tabernacle celebration all over the world in churches and in even big stadiums. It was an amazing mass movement that came to happen because of COVID. But now the doors are open. People can come back. Just 3 days ago, I was again in the arena, the big hall in Jerusalem, where we plan to have the Feast of Tabernacles. And what we are planning to do is the theme this year is the land of promise. And we want to accomplish two things. First of all, we want to present what the miracle of the land of Israel. It's an amazing success story. Israel is in so many ways a miracle in itself. Just give you one example that if you search on the internet the subject of desertification, you will find that wherever there is a desert in the world, it's expanding. It's one of the great problems of mankind. It's connected to global warming. And the only country in the world today where the desert is retreating is the nation of Israel. And this not just for a few years, but for decades. And we just met a few days ago with some of the leaders of KKL. They said this is not only that trees are planted in hundreds of millions over the past decades, but it's changing the climate of the Middle East. And John Kerry was visiting, the former Secretary of State of the United States. He was visiting Israel just recently. He says there is one country which has the solution for global warming, and this is the nation of Israel. And he was just meeting some of the people in Israel that are engaged with tree planting, etc. We want to show people during the feast some of this stuff that's happening, very exciting developments. Also, we want to take the feast to different locations, but we do believe that the Feast of Tabernacles, and that's what I really want everybody to understand, it's not just another Christian conference that just happened to be in Jerusalem. The Feast of Tabernacles in Leviticus chapter 23, it's called a Feast of the Lord. The Word of God uses the Hebrew word moed. And if you know a little bit Hebrew, moed is something like, I had today in my calendar 10 o'clock interview with ICEJ UK, and there was this calendar entry in my calendar. And in a way you can say a moed in the Hebrew meaning is like there is a divine calendar entry in the calendar of God where he says that's my appointed time, my time when I'm going to meet my people. And I tell you, Simon, we had so many amazing testimonies over the past decades, how people got healed, how people got called, where people come to Jerusalem, they say, we never experienced the presence of the Lord so much than at the Feast of Tabernacles. And I want to encourage everybody to join us. It will be an amazing time again. We need your prayer. We have only half a year now to prepare it. I'll just open 2 weeks the gates. And that's an official invitation to join us here in Israel. Not next year, but this year in Jerusalem.
So there you go. You heard it from Jurgen himself that you need to book your tickets now for the Feast of Tabernacles.
Amen. Absolutely.
And Jurgen, as we discuss the horrendous situation facing the Ukraine, unprovoked Russian invasion of the Ukraine, the biggest invasion of any sovereign European nation that we've seen in over 80 years since the Second World War. Now it's caused the biggest refugee crisis since the Second World War. I think they're talking about 2.5 million Ukrainians have fled Ukraine because of the war situation. And of course, there are so many Jewish people. Apparently, there's something around a region of 43,000 Jewish people in Ukraine, together at the time before the invasion, and somewhere between 10 and 15,000 Israelis living there. And of course, now the Jewish Agency has stepped up their efforts to help make Aliyah, the Jewish people, to return back to Israel to escape the conflict. Can you just give us your insight into what's happening and what ICEJ is doing to help bring God's people home? Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's on the one side a heartbreaking crisis, but it's also at the same time it's an opportunity to see how God is fulfilling his prophecy. You know, there's in the prophet Isaiah, it says, God says, I'm going to send the fishermen and then the hunters to bring my people back. And in a way, it almost feels like that this is a season where God is really shaking the nation of Ukraine and also Russia, we have to say. And the result of that shaking is that the number of people who immigrate to Israel is quadrupling or even more. They will expect record numbers of Ukrainian Jews this year to come to the land of Israel. Now, you need to understand they have a much easier route and probably better prospects for their life if they would go to Germany or France or the UK. Maybe the economic system might be more stable there. The societies might be more ready to welcome refugees. But they make a decision to go back to Israel. And that's very significant to see this today. And what is even more significant is to see that
Christians, not only the ICEJ, so many Christians around the world, they are backing up this effort to help the Jewish people coming back. We are actually right now, this is just happening over the last few days. We have a team down in Ukraine. David Elms knows him very well. Shimon Shabak, our man in Haifa, and he's right now with the team. I think it's around 30, 40 people, Israelis in Ukraine, helping Jewish people to come back. And we are working right now in particular to look out for Holocaust survivors, people who experienced the greatest atrocity in their childhood and in their youth. And we want to make sure that they can, at least the last years of their lives, live in peace in the land of their fathers. So we have special transportation for them to bring them to the border of Poland or Hungary or Slovakia. They will receive special care of different people from the Jewish Agency, but also from Christians that help them to come as unbureaucratic and as fast as possible back to Israel. And some of them, I really look forward to meet them. They will be in our Haifa home for Holocaust survivors in Haifa. And in parallel, we are working, shared with you about what's happening in Finland. They are bringing food transports there. I know Norway is already talking about our Norwegian branch to do the very same thing. We have buses that are right now in Romania, organized by our branch there, driving back and forth from the Ukrainian border to the city of Brasov and to bring people to the airport and to the offices of the Jewish community. The same is taking place in Slovakia. So we are working on many different fronts right now in order to help as much as possible the Jewish people to come back. And of course, when people are coming to our teams, we definitely will not tell them, we cannot take you, you are not Jewish, we will not help you. They're open for everybody. But of course, the main focus of this work is directed as ICEJ to the Jewish people.
And Jurgen, can you just share with us the very special relationship that ICEJ has, not only with the Israeli government, but also with government institutions, in particular the work that you do with the Jewish Agency under normal circumstances? That relationship is special, helping the Jewish people, maybe from Britain or from Europe, to make Aliyah to Israel. But the situation in Ukraine is very, very different, and the Jewish Agency is under a huge amounts of pressure to help get as many Jewish people as they can out of the Ukraine and from the neighboring countries. Can you share with us what it's like on the ground, actually helping and working with the Jewish Agency?
Yeah, there is an amazing collaboration going on right now. You see this very practically. I mentioned the Haifa home for Holocaust survivors that we are having. At this Haifa home, we also installed a call center. It actually just started last year, which is a call center for Jerusalem and for Haifa, where elderly people can call if they are in need, and there are motor scooters helping them immediately. We have been approached by the Prime Minister's office just, I think, a week ago. They said our phone lines of the Jewish Agency are completely overloaded. Can we use also your call center, that we redirect the numbers to you and you take down the details of the people that want to make Aliyah? So right now our office in Haifa is actually working together with the Jewish Agency, receiving calls from the Ukraine of people who want to make Aliyah. And we have excellent relationship, not only to the workers on the ground, but also to the senior leadership. The last president or chairman of the Jewish Agency is the president today of the State of Israel, Isaac Herzog. We had a very close, friendly relationship with him during his tenure as chairman, and we met him many times. And it's really a friendship and a partnership in vision that we are joining with the Jewish Agency and with many other organizations. Just yesterday, I was at KKL, Keren Kayemet Israel. They are taking care of the nature in Israel with Keren Hayes. So there are many other. Yad Vashem, we have a special partnership with Yad Vashem. So on all levels, we are working very closely together with the big institutions here in the land.
And Jurgen, according to the Times of Israel today, they say that 5,000 Jewish people have made Aliyah during this conflict from Eastern Europe. 3,000 is believed to have come out of the Ukraine over the past 3 weeks, and another 2,000 from Russia as well. Can you share with us how prophetic these times are? Because we could see the biggest wave of Aliyah since 1991, when we saw the collapse of the Berlin Wall, followed by the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, led 1.5 million Jews of the former Soviet Union to make Aliyah to Israel. And we could see another massive, large number that we haven't seen in a generation. Share with us how God is fulfilling his word and bringing his people home in fulfillment of the promises in Isaiah and Jeremiah and the prophets.
Yeah, very gladly I do so. You know, there are a lot of people today, they speculate about what's happening in Russia. And of course, the first thing that if you are aware of biblical prophecy, you are tempted to think about when you speak about Russia is Gog and Magog. And there are a lot of speculations out. I saw recently a guy on video up on the Lebanese borders, and he says, we are just in the days of Gog and Magog. And in a way, it's, of course, a very catchy headline to read that and to see that. I believe for two reasons: that this is not yet the scenario that Ezekiel 38 and 39 describes. Number one, it's not this big alliance of different nations that the prophet speaks about. It's actually only one nation, pretty much isolated from the rest of the world. And plus it says Israel at this time of Gog and Magog will be in uttermost peace and security, without bars and without gates. Israel is today probably the most alert nation in the world, militarily speaking. So it's definitely not, it didn't let his bars down or its gates open. It's at a absolute high security stand right now. But I believe the prophetic dynamic that is unfolding today is what many of the prophets are saying. Jeremiah in chapter 23, he says we are going to see times, he says, that will overshadow or that will outgrow the scenario that we experienced in Egypt, when God took out with a strong hand the people of God out of Egypt, delivered them from Pharaoh. He says there will come times where you not anymore say, thus says the Lord who brought Israel out of Egypt, but you will say, thus says the Lord who brought his people out of the land of the north and of the east and the west. And I think this is what we are seeing today. What this crisis really brings forth in prophetic dynamic is that it's releasing another wave of Aliyah from the country of the north, you know, and this is not just Russia, this is not just Ukraine, this is the whole northern region right now is in a big shakeup. All the neighboring countries, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, they all are afraid maybe we will be the next one where Russian armies are moving in. And there's a lot of activity going on in all those countries where they are thinking to return back to Israel. It's maybe not as big as the big wave that we saw in '89 and the 90s when the Iron Curtain was opened, but it's definitely going to be one of the biggest waves in the past decades.
Oh, it's absolutely incredible. Jurgen, can you also share with us really that the role that Christians need to play in the times in which we're living in, primarily because despite Israel's success as a nation and the more global problems there are, the more Israel comes to the forefront with solutions, and particularly going into the 21st century in technology terms, that Israel is one of the leading nations in terms of the startup nation and innovation and technology. And this is why Britain has now developed probably the closest relationship that our nation has ever had with the state of Israel in our history. But we're also seeing at the same time a huge rise of Jew hatred around the world, levels that we haven't seen since the 1930s and 40s, times when the Jewish communities across the world feel scared, afraid to actually wear any Jewish clothing in case they fear attack or abuse, and then online abuse is horrific. What role do you think Christians can play in standing with our Jewish brothers and sisters to confront this evil that is Jew hatred and bring them that reassurance that Christians may have been silent 80 years ago, but today we're not silent?
No, absolutely. You know, we need to be a church and we need to be a people that indeed really learns the lesson from history. You know, if I look back in my own history, German history, one of the great failures of the church in Germany in the 30s was that the church was silent. And there are many proven records of Adolf Hitler where he actually was observing very well the church, what they are doing. He said, well, let's check if there is an opposition coming from the church. And when he realized they actually stay silent and they even support him, he realized there's nothing in the way for his plans in Germany. That was, by the way, the reason he did the Kristallnacht. This was in a way a test case in Germany. How will the population deal with a case where synagogues are burning, where Jewish people are dragged to the streets and put in concentration camp? And he found out very quickly that the church was a bystander at large. They didn't voice any opposition to it, and he didn't have to be afraid of any opposition from the church or from the religious side. And I think today the church really cannot afford anymore to be silent. I believe it would be devastating. I honestly believe it would attract the judgment of God upon the church if the church would again be silent in the face of anti-Semitism. Because we should know today our history books better than anybody in the world. We Christians should see what did the churches do in Europe, what did the church do in Germany, what can we learn from that, not to repeat that again. We serve a God who is watching mankind, and you know, the Bible tells us the Jewish people, they are the apple of God's eye, and he's watching the church, how we are dealing with them. You know, we are celebrating now the feast of Purim, and the story of Esther is exactly that. She was even Jewish, you know, she was as a queen as the first lady, so to speak, of the most powerful empire in the world at the time, the Persian Empire. She had an incredible, powerful position, but she wasn't so sure if she really should dare to go into the king and said, I'm not sure if this will not harm my position. The king didn't call me for quite some time. It's quite risky to do that. And Mordechai in Esther chapter 4, he said some very sobering words. He says, Esther, you need to understand you have been called for a time like that. If you remain silent, and I'm afraid that many Christians today again remain silent when synagogues are burning. I talked to Danny Dayan, the new chairman of Yad Vashem, just a few weeks ago. He said only during his tenure as a general counsel in New York, in his area where he was responsible as diplomat in America, 25 Jews were killed because of anti-Semitic attacks. And it's a time where we really need to speak up. And Mordechai said to Esther, says, if you remain silent, God will raise up somebody else, but you and your house will perish. And in a way, these are very sobering words. Number one, it's encouraging for the Jewish people. God is not going to let down the Jewish people. But I'm concerned for the nations of the West. I'm concerned of the church. Did we really learn the lesson from the past? Are we a church that is speaking up? And you can do this in many ways. Number one, prayer. Prayer changes situation. This was the number one agent that Esther used during her time to change the heart of the king from signing a document to persecute Jews to a document that the Jews can defend themselves. And even he made Mordechai as the deputy of his office. And prayer can change the heart of kings. Number two, our voice need to be heard. If they just would have prayed and Queen Esther would have not gone into the king, nothing would have changed. And we need our voice. We are living in democratic countries. We can send letters to our representatives. We can send letters to the media if we are not happy with what we are reading. If we feel there is fake news about Israel, we need to speak up. If we are not doing it, who shall do it? So it's really a time where the church is called for task. And I think this Purim time is really a time to remind us on that.
Amen. Thank you for that very timely message, I think, for all of us. And Jurgen, finally, we have most of the team from ICEJ UK. So what are your thoughts on the British team or the British branch of ICEJ?
Well, it's a fantastic team. Number one, I think you are blessed with a great leader with David Elms. We have him many times in Jerusalem. as a leading theologian at the Christian Zionist camp, and we cherish his insight in different webinars and during the Feast of Tabernacles and other events. And so the British branch is blessed, I think, to have one of the strongest theologians of the ICEJ to lead your branch. And I want to encourage every pastor, even listening to this web call, to invite David Elms. It will be a great blessing for all of you. But also there's a lot of activity going on. We saw over the last few years a tremendous growth in the UK branch, and there's a lot of activity. Even, you are one of the first branches to use the new media, going out with webinars and podcasts, etc. That's very exciting. And I think you all should not forget that United Kingdom has an incredible legacy. It was the #1 Christian Zionist country in the world, where Christian Zionism, where theology of Christian Zionism was developed by the British Puritans. And as a matter of fact, speaking to you as a German, there was for many decades, if not centuries, a very strong alliance between German Christians and British Christians, where they were thinking about what can we do in order to bless the Jewish people. Christ Church in Jerusalem was a German-British endeavor that started together with German pastors and British pastors that reached out to the Jewish people in Israel. So in a way, there's an incredible legacy, and we are very proud to have a very strong and dynamic branch in the UK. We see you, of course, always at the Feast of Tabernacles. Peter Bentley, who is with us on this call in the background, he also is serving at the Feast of Tabernacles in a critical role to get things happening as a stage manager. So there are many, many areas how the ICEJ UK have become an absolute vital part of the work of the ICEJ in Jerusalem.
Jurgen, it's an absolute pleasure to share your heart, your passion for Israel, your passion for the Jewish people, and also your own personal family story, which is incredible, that needs to be told. And thank you for the incredible work that you do as president of ICEJ. I'm going to hand over to Dr. David Elms to sum up, unless a few of you in the closing moments have a few questions that you would like to ask Jurgen, as I think we've all been touched by what he's had to say tonight. Over to David.
Well, it's been quite amazing. As you just said, Simon, what a comprehensive account from our President Jurgen Buhler, from his personal life to the contemporary ministry that ICEJ throughout this world is operating in. And I'd just like to say to our viewers and our listeners that, look, please keep in touch with us in the UK. Get in touch with our office, and we will tell you about our feasts, our conferences, our Rosh Kodesh prayer. And, you're going to be absolutely so impressed and so blessed, and you can play a part in this. And this is what we want. It's not just some people talking to you about what's going on in far off lands. We want you to be a part of this living, wonderful organization, the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem, your embassy. You can be a part. Please keep in touch. You'll see the details that will come up. Thank you, Jurgen. Thank you, Simon. It's been a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. And I just want to conclude by saying that from Jurgen's experience in confronting anti-Semitism, that we can all play a major role in doing that. We need to support the Jewish people that are fleeing the war in Ukraine. You can do that by supporting the ministry that is ICEJ UK. So shalom, and thank you so much for joining us on this Jerusalem Dispatch Zoom event. Shalom and Laila Tov.
Catch the wind, he's carrying